On the morning of Monday, February 6th, 2017, a group of 7 friends who were all college-aged and living in New Zealand began packing up their cars and getting ready to drive back to Auckland, the biggest city in New Zealand. The night before, the group had been out on Lake Tikitapu for a big concert called Flocella, where audience members would listen to the music while floating around on big blow-up rafts and floats. After the concert had ended, the group of friends had left the lake and headed to a nearby relative's house where they had a quiet after-party with a couple of drinks, and then everyone went to bed a little bit after midnight. This morning, the group had gotten up early because they wanted to get on the road as soon as possible to try to beat the holiday traffic that was sure to crop up that day on the way back to Auckland. February 6th is a big national holiday in New Zealand. It's called Waitangi Day, and it's to commemorate the initial signing of the Treaty of Waitangi, which is considered to be the founding document of the country. But right as the 7 friends had finished packing up their 3 cars and were getting ready to begin their 3-hour drive north to Auckland, one of the friends, a 21-year-old named Rachel DeJong, suggested they take a quick detour before they head back home. Rachel, along with another girl in this group of friends named Maddie, had several months earlier discovered this secret swimming spot that was located only about 15 minutes away from where they were now, and it happened to be on the way back to Auckland. This swimming spot was this beautiful green-blue pool of fairly deep water that was located in the middle of a forest. This pool was actually a part of the Waikato River. However, this stretch of the river where the pool was either very shallow or dry most of the time. So as a result, this pool actually looked like a standalone body of water. While there was no official trail that led through the forest to this pool of water, there was an unofficial trail. It was basically a dirt trail that cut through the woods that had formed over the years of locals tromping their way to this pool of water. After hearing Rachel's suggestion, the group of friends all agreed that this sounded like a great idea. And so the group piled into their 3 cars, and then by around 11:40 a.m., Rachel and Maddie had directed the convoy all the way to the start of this unofficial dirt trail, which was located right on the side of a winding main road. After pulling their cars safely off to the side of the road, the group got out, and then Rachel and Maddie led them to the start of this trail, and they began walking through the forest. 15 minutes later, at 11:55 a.m., the group was getting very close to the water because the trees up ahead were starting to thin out. But also at 11:55 a.m., the group suddenly stopped because from somewhere out in the forest, way off in front of them, came this loud, shrill siren sound. And it went on for nearly 20 or 30 seconds, and then it just came to a stop. And the group kind of looked around at each other. No one knew what to make of the siren, and so eventually they just kind of shrugged it off and kept on walking. Within a minute of that siren sound coming to an end, the group had made it to the end of this unofficial dirt track, which placed them at the edge of this beautiful overlook down to the pool they were going to swim in. And so they began one by one climbing down the rocks in front of them, where there were some ropes that had been put up to help people climb down to the water. And so after they got down to the water, all of them stripped down to their bathing suits, they jumped into the pool, and they began swimming out towards the center of the pool, where there were these 2 big rocks that jutted up out of the water, almost like miniature islands. And so Rachel and the other women, so 5 of them, they climbed onto one of the rocks, and the 2 men who were part of this group climbed onto the other rock. And so they got up onto these rocks, and they're looking around, taking in the sights, and then at 11:58 a.m., another siren blasts across the forest. It's the same sound as the one they heard 3 minutes earlier when they were on the dirt track. And so once again, all 7 of them are kind of looking at each other wondering, what is this siren about? But after the 20 or 30 second long siren came to an end, they glanced around them and there was no sign of any danger. There was no sign of really anything happening at all. It was just this beautiful, peaceful seeming oasis. And so before long, they had forgotten about the siren again, and Rachel had gotten out her camera and she was taking pictures, and others were taking pictures as well. And then 2 minutes later, at 12 p.m., the siren sounded for a 3rd time. Now, at this point, the group has heard the siren 2 other times. And even though the sound of the siren was kind of jarring because it was so high-pitched and shrill and really cut into their ears, this time, because they've heard it 2 other times and nothing happened, they all pretty much immediately wrote it off. So the siren's sounding for the 3rd time, and the group is not really paying attention. But when the siren finally stops this 3rd time, something very different began to happen, and the group immediately noticed it. Now, I know everyone has a lot to do to prepare for International Pet and Electric Eel Day. From the eel cigarettes to lure the slippery, cuddly little creatures out of the murky deep, to the mega-sized pack of ace bandages you'll need for post-shock wound care, there's a lot you need to enjoy this holiday. But what always happens when you fire up your wood-fired laptop and begin looking for these items? You get hit with a pua! Bah! 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 But don't worry, you can get back to doing what you love, petting electrically charged animals in the name of tradition, if you just use NordVPN. A VPN, or virtual private network, is a service that keeps you safe when you browse the internet, and NordVPN is the brand name in the VPN space. Not only will NordVPN ensure that all of your data stays safely behind their wall of next-generation encryption, but also, most importantly, through their latest feature called Threat Protection, they will automatically block all those disgusting puas that keep disrupting your ability to purchase all of your various eel petting supplies. So, you can either sit on the sidelines this year while your family frolics about in the murky pools and calm stretches of the middle and lower Amazon and Orinoco river basins in South America petting truckloads of electric eels, or you can get NordVPN and before long you'll be up to your nostrils in cuddly electric eels looking for a good pet. Currently, the best deal for NordVPN is through my YouTube offer. Right now, you can get a 2-year plan at a huge discount plus 4 additional months for free when you go to nordvpn.com/MrBallen. It's risk-free with Nord's 30-day money-back guarantee. That's nordvpn.com/MrBallen or click the link in the description. Okay, back to the story. When the third siren came to a stop, the friends started to hear a new sound, and it was coming from the same direction the siren had been coming from, which in effect was upstream. Even though this river was basically dry, they could turn and look uphill, and they could clearly see where the river would go if it was full. And so the friends turn and look upstream, and they're listening to this really loud kind of smashing sound that's coming from that direction, and they're exchanging curious looks at each other, trying to figure out what that sound could be, and then all of a sudden they see it. A white wall of water comes crashing around the corner and began barreling straight down the riverbed towards them. By the time the friends had even processed what they were seeing, the water had reached the pool they were in, and it was flooding the pool so quickly they could literally see this huge pool rising. Its water levels were going up and up and up all around them. And so as the rocks they're standing on began to slowly submerge under all this rising water, the group collectively decided that this can't go on for very long. Whatever this is, it's gonna stop, so just stay put, stay on these rocks, we're gonna be okay. However, within seconds, the rocks they were on were completely submerged, and the water was still tumbling down the hill towards their pool, and then spilling out over the other side down the other end of the riverbed. And they're thinking to themselves, if we don't get off these rocks soon, we're gonna get swept downstream with this water. And so the two men who were on their own rock, they leapt to a rocky outcropping that was slightly higher up and was connected back up to the forest. And so this rocky outcropping represented safety. And so once they were up there, they turned around and they yelled to the 5 women still stranded on their rock to try to swim over to them, and the guys would grab them and pull them to safety. But by this point, the girls are looking around, the water's up to their knees, and it's rushing past them. They can barely keep their balance. They know if they attempt to swim in this water, they're gonna immediately be taken downstream with it. And so the group very quickly decides their only choice is for the women to literally jump and grab the men who have their arms outstretched for them. And so Rachel DeJong, she was the first one to try this. She leaps off the rock, she grabs the guy's arms, and she gets pulled to safety. And then she turns around, and she and the other 2 men continue to get the women to jump off the rock to them. And at first, it's going fairly well until they get down to the second to last woman, who leaps, she grabs one of the guy's arms, and then both of them lose their footing, and the guy and the woman, they both get swept away downstream, they're gone. Rachel stays calm, and she moves to the position where the guy had been who just got swept away, and she takes out her GoPro camera camera selfie stick and she extends it out to the last woman who's out on the rock. Her name is Alice. And she tells Alice, jump and grab the selfie stick. And so Alice, who's almost completely submerged in water now, makes this frantic jump to grab onto the selfie stick. She grabs it for a second, but then loses her grip and she begins being swept away. And Rachel, who at this point was completely safe, immediately jumped into the rapids after Alice. She grabbed Alice, she attempted to turn around and grab the rock to stop them, but she couldn't get a grip. And she and Alice were also swept downstream out of view. 2 weeks before Rachel, Maddie, Alice, and the others had gone to this secret swimming spot, a warning sign, like a physical warning sign that warned people not to go near this river, don't go near this pool, was stolen. And that warning sign was normally placed at the very beginning of that unofficial dirt track that the 7 friends took to get to the pool. Meaning, when the 7 friends got out of their cars and began hiking into the forest to go to this pool, they would not have understood the danger of where they were going. Now, it is true that Rachel and Maddie had previously discovered this swim spot several months earlier. However, it seems like they had just learned that this swim spot existed and how to get to it. It did not seem like they had literally walked this trail and gotten to the pool, and so very likely they would not have known about the dangers this place posed. The pool of water they were swimming in was not actually dangerous itself. It was only dangerous because the pool was located in the middle of a spill zone. About 650 feet upstream of the pool they were swimming in is a dam, and 3 to 4 times a day, they open their gates, releasing 20,000 gallons of water per second down this mostly dry riverbed, and the water comes careening across that pool all the way to the bottom. The gates stay open for about 15 minutes, and the only reason this is done is for the spectacle of it. It's to show tourists what this riverbed looked like before the dam was built. And what this riverbed looked like before the dam was built was a raging rapid. On February 6th, 2017, the dam was set to spill at 12 p.m. So those sirens the friends heard at 11:55, 11:58, and then 12 were all warnings that a spill was about to occur. But of course, the 7 friends had no idea. After the 12 p.m. spill had finally ended, the 3 friends who had made it to the rocky outcropping and had not been swept away by the current went looking for the 4 other friends who had been swept away, and they would find them. 3 had miraculously survived, but 1 had not. The sole fatality was 21-year-old Rachel DeJong, whose idea it was to come and swim at this spot in the first place. Rachel also was the woman who had left safety and jumped back into the rapids to attempt to save her friend, Alice. Today, there are many more warning signs and fences that have been put up around the Waikato River to prevent people from getting too close, because the dam still, despite the fatality, spills several times a day. However, despite all these precautions and all the notoriety around Rachel's death, people still today sneak in and go swimming in that secret pool. So that's going to do it. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please send the like button a beautifully wrapped gift for their birthday, but fill the gift with a spring-loaded boxing glove that punches them in the face as soon as they open it. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. We now have a podcast called the MrBallen's Podcast that puts out brand new podcast exclusive stories on Monday mornings and remastered versions of our best YouTube videos on Thursday mornings. This podcast is going to be exclusive to Amazon Music starting November 1st of this year. But as of right now, it is still available on all podcast platforms everywhere. We now have a registered 501c3 charitable organization called the MrBallen's Foundation that makes it as easy as possible for you to join me, my family, and my team in supporting those whose lives have been most impacted by violent and heinous crimes. Monthly donors to the MrBallen's Foundation Honor Them Society will receive free gifts and exclusive invites to special live events. But the real reward is helping to rewrite the ending to the story for victims of violent crime. Go to MrBallen.Foundation and click Get Involved to join the Honor Them Society today. We also have 2 additional YouTube channels. One is called MrBallen Shorts. The other is called MrBallen en Español. We also put out near daily content on Facebook, Snapchat, and TikTok. Those are all just called MrBallen. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username is just @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. We also have some really cool merchandise, so head on over to shopmrballen.com to have a look. And if you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit, just called Mr. Ballen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, Facebook, other YouTube channels, the podcast, wherever, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. In 1804, a man named John Bell decided his farm in North Carolina was just too small for his growing family. So he, along with his wife Lucy and their 6 kids, packed all their belongings onto wagons and then traveled more than 600 miles west to this 1,000-acre patch along the Red River in northern Tennessee. The area they settled was known as Robertson County, and at the time, it was very rural and basically nobody lived there. And so the Bell family, when they arrived in Robertson County, fully expected to have to work with the few families that were there to build up the settlement. Basically, they wanted to build a town from scratch. But this was the kind of work that John Bell was born for. He was raised on a farm where he had a reputation for working extremely hard and never giving up. John was very generous and excellent at working with other people. In fact, when his family was still in North Carolina, John and his very gentle and sweet wife Lucy would open their door to anybody who needed a place to stay or a hot meal. And sometimes John would just give money to his neighbors when he felt like they were down on hard times. So, after arriving in Robertson County, and after the Bell family had met their few neighbors, John Bell got right to work. First, he began clearing trees off of his land, and then with that lumber, he built a 1.5-story log house up on this hill not far from the Red River. And in fact, the Red River was a very popular picnic spot and fishing spot for the few people that lived in Robertson County. And so in virtue of the Bell's house being so near the river, the Bell family was always running into their neighbors and saying hi and making friends. And so it wasn't long after John and his family had arrived and built this house that the Bell family became one of the most popular families in the area. And for many years, the Bell family lived a very happy and prosperous life in Robertson County. Most mornings, John would wake up first, and then he would rouse the children, who would then leave the house and walk through the nearby woods to go to their school, and then they'd come back before sunset. And then while the kids were at school during the day, John and his older sons would go out and work the land or help build structures around town to build the settlement up, or they would build the boats that they would use to transport the tobacco and meats they produced on their farm down south for trade. John and Lucy would have 3 more kids while in Robertson County, and before long, their oldest children began getting married and starting families of their own and building their own houses nearby. But one summer day in 1817, so 13 years after the Bell family first arrived in Robertson County, John would have a very strange experience that at the time he would completely write off. But years later, they would look back and say, that's when it started. On that summer day in 1817, John was by himself. He was out walking through his cornfield near his house when he looked out and he saw this big dog just sitting in the middle of the cornfield. Now, there were lots of dogs around Robertson County, so it wasn't unusual to run into a dog while you were out and about. But there was something off about this dog. It almost looked misshapen, like its bones had broken many times over and reset at awkward angles. And this dog just looked way too big to be a dog. It almost looked more like a big wolf. And this dog was staring at John in a very human way, not breaking eye contact, staring right at John. Now, John was not someone who easily spooked. But standing in this cornfield, staring at this dog who was staring right back at him, John couldn't help but feel totally unsettled and a little bit panicked. And so John, who had his rifle with him, raised it and fired in the direction of this dog. And when he did, the dog took off running. And so John, he watched as this dog galloped away from him and disappeared into the tree line of the forest far away. And once the dog was totally out of view, John marched forward to the spot in the cornfield where this dog had been sitting. And when he got there, he was expecting to see the corn kind of pressed down from where this big animal had been sitting, but it wasn't. There was no sign that any big creature had been sitting right there. And as he looked around him, he saw there were no paw prints, no tracks on the ground, either coming to this spot or going in the direction that he watched this big dog run off. John was totally confused by this, but after sitting there kind of wondering how this could be, he just told himself, you know what, I'm overthinking this. It was just some big ugly dog and a missed shot. This is no big deal. And so John promptly turned around and walked back to his house, forgetting all about the dog. But not long after John saw this dog in the cornfield, his family began experiencing other strange things back at their house. At night, after the Bell family had climbed into bed, they would start hearing a knocking sound on the side of their house. And as soon as they got up to go inspect it, the knocking would stop. And then they'd lay back down again and they would hear it again, except it was coming from another side of the house. It was like there was someone or something outside of their house just kind of circling around them, periodically knocking on their walls. Now, John was convinced this was not the work of some animal. This was a person, a prankster, and they were hiding out in the woods somewhere. And so he instructed his family not to mention the tapping sounds to anybody in town because he thought somebody in town was doing this to them and he didn't want them to know that they were onto them. He wanted these pranksters to come back and do it again so he could catch them in the act. But over the course of several weeks, the tapping continued, and every time John would lay in wait and try to run out and see who was there, there'd be no one. And there'd be no tracks anywhere around the house indicating that anyone had ever been there. And as unsettling as these knocking sounds were for the family, they were nothing compared to the things that happened next. My pet frog, Seagull Lung, is a huge fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, and so for his birthday, which was last week, he asked me if I would take him on a special camping trip where all we did was sat around the fire and I just told crazy stories. And so of course I said, sure, Lung, I can do that for you. And then, on his big day, old Lungy came bounding down the stairs, all excited for his big camping trip. And I stopped him and I said, hold on a minute, Lung. Forget the camping trip. I got something even better for your birthday. And then, from behind my back, I presented a gift fit for the gods. Homemade fermented Norwegian lemming liver cakes with a side of koala stew. Now I know what you're thinking. Wow, Lungy must have been so happy. But no, he wasn't. Turns out my gift was gross and way worse than a strange, dark, and mysterious themed camping trip. But there was a silver lining to this minor birthday snafu. After Lungy refused to eat my beautiful gift, I went online to try to figure out what Lungy would eat. And so I typed into Google, who has the best food in the world? And 2 words popped up that changed my life. Hello Fresh. With HelloFresh, America's #1 meal kit, you can skip the grocery store and take control of your time and budget with delicious food delivered right to your door. With over 35 weekly recipes, they have the options you're looking for to help you achieve your New Year goals. Choose calorie smart or carb smart recipes, or even customize select meals by swapping proteins or sides, or upgrading your proteins, or adding a protein to a veggie dish. And with HelloFresh, you always get top quality. Their ingredients come from the farm to you in 7 days, so you literally are eating fresh. HelloFresh. So, if you're like me and you keep gifting your loved ones terrible exotic food dishes for their birthday, then you need to sign up for HelloFresh today. To do that, go to HelloFresh.com and use code MrBallen21 for 21 free meals and free shipping. Again, go to HelloFresh.com and use code MrBallen21 for 21 free meals and free shipping. Okay, back to the story. One Sunday night in May of 1818, so roughly 1 year after John had seen that big dog in the cornfield, and a couple of months after the knocking on the walls had begun in the Bell's household, 4 of John's sons were asleep in their bedroom inside of their home when they woke up to the sound of what sounded like a rat gnawing on one of their bedposts. Now, these boys were sleeping in 2 bunk beds, and the 2 oldest brothers were sleeping on the lower bunk. And so they instinctively got up, stepped onto the floor to go find this rat, but the second they stepped onto the floor, the gnawing sound completely disappeared. The 2 boys searched the room for this rat, they couldn't find it, and when they checked all of the bedposts, there was no sign that any of them had been gnawed on. So the 2 older brothers finally just kind of shrugged it off and climbed back in bed. The moment they closed their eyes, the gnawing sound began again. Except now it was louder and more frantic, like whatever was under there was desperately trying to chew through the wood of their beds. But again, when the two older brothers leapt out of their bed to go find whatever animal was doing this, the sound would completely stop and the room would go still. The boys searched the room again. There was no sign of any rat or any animal. There were no marks on the underside of their beds, and so they had no idea what to make of this. The gnawing sounds would continue all that night, making it nearly impossible for these boys to sleep, and it would happen again the next night the same way. But on the night after that, so the third night, the boys heard a new sound in their room. As they're laying in their beds, exhausted from barely sleeping the last 2 nights, they began hearing what sounded like someone gasping for air underneath their beds, like they were being choked. They were gulping and smacking their lips and clawing at the underside of the beds. The 2 oldest boys were terrified, but eventually worked up the courage and leapt from their bed to confront whatever was underneath them. But again, as soon as their feet hit the floor, the sounds completely stopped and the room went still. But this time, the boys were so frightened, they decided not to try to just go back to sleep. Instead, they woke up the rest of their family, and the Bell family searched the entire house, top to bottom, looking for any indication of what could have been making those sounds. But there was nothing in their house. There was no marks from some animal or rat. There was no indication that anything was other than normal. Now, to this point, the Bell family had not told anybody in town about either the knocking sounds on the walls, or the rat gnawing sounds, or now the gulping for air sounds. And a part of that was because John had told the family, don't tell anyone because we're going to catch whoever's doing this. But another part of it was the family knew as soon as they brought this stuff up, they could be the target of ridicule because people wouldn't believe them. But after this night, with the gulping and gasping sounds, the Bell kids really could not sleep anymore. They were just up all night, terrified. And so finally, John went to one of his neighbors who he was very close with and confided in him that something weird was happening inside of his house. Now, John was not the kind of person who made things up. He was very straightforward, very honest. He didn't even tell jokes. And so this neighbor, as he's listening to this unbelievable story, just takes John at face value and says, you know what? I'll stay the night in your house and I'll see if I can hear all these strange sounds. That night, the neighbor would stay with John Bell and his family in the Bell household. And sure enough, the neighbor would hear the tapping on the walls, he would hear the rat gnawing on the wood post in the boys' room, as well as that gasping and gulping sound coming from the boys' room. And this neighbor was so terrified that he did not last the night in John's house. He left in the middle of the night to go back to his house. After this, word spread quickly around Robertson County about what was happening at the Bell household, and the way the townspeople reacted was very supportive. The Bell family had been instrumental in building up the settlement, and John and his wife Lucy were so kind and generous, and so the townspeople decided that they were going to find a way to rally around the Bell family and try to help them. So other people in town began volunteering to spend the night inside of the Bell household with the Bell family. One, because they wanted the Bell family to feel some security, having some more people around them. And two, these people were thinking that maybe just their presence inside of the Bell household would scare off whoever or whatever was tormenting the Bells. But no matter who stayed inside of the Bell household, the noises persisted every single night. Townspeople came up with all sorts of explanations for what was happening to the Bell family, ranging from, John's youngest daughter must be behind this because she wants attention, or other people said maybe there's a family or an individual that hates the Bell family and they're targeting them and they're behind this. There was even a theory that someone in town had learned ventriloquism, which is a kind of performance where the ventriloquist throws their voice so it sounds like it's coming from somewhere else, not from their body. And so the idea was this ventriloquist was just a prankster and they were screwing with the Bell family. But the townspeople searched the Bell's house with the Bell family over and over again, and they never found any sign of what could be making these noises. The people in town even went so far as to have people watch each member of the Bell family as they slept at night to make sure none of them were responsible for these sounds. And sure enough, as the Bell family was being closely monitored, the noises would start, and it was very clearly not coming from anyone in the Bell family. As the months went on, and the Bell family was forced to endure whatever was going on inside of their home, the people in town started to notice something odd about John Bell. Normally, John was a very engaged person, that when he spoke to you, he was locked onto you and really paying attention. But at some point, after these mysterious things began happening at his house, John would be talking to someone, and then suddenly his eyes would kind of gloss over and his jaw would go slack, and it would look like he was staring off into the distance. And then his face would start to twitch. And at first, these twitches were fairly minor and were centered just around his eyes. But over time, these twitches became much more dramatic, to the point where his jaw would start to kind of quiver up and down, and his eyes would begin blinking out of sync. And then when the twitching finally stopped, John, without saying a word to the person he had just been talking to, would just wander back to his house. He'd go up to his bedroom, and he would sit on his bed for hours and hours and hours, just staring at the wall, not eating, not drinking, not saying anything. The Bell family felt like they were hostages in their own home. They had no idea what was causing these things to happen or why they were happening, and they were all filled with this constant sense of dread. As for the townspeople, most of them had come to believe that whatever was happening to the Bell family was likely caused by their neighbor, Kate Batts. Kate was known to be very eccentric and kind of unpleasant, and she was known to be fairly unlucky because her husband had become disabled and her 3 kids had all died young. Kate also had this strange habit of using really big, complex words in her conversations, but she misused the words, and so everything she said kind of sounded off. Townspeople would talk about Kate Batts' witch, and they started referring to whatever was causing these strange phenomenon at the Bell household as just Kate. However, when Kate found out about this, she was totally offended and said she had nothing to do with whatever was happening to the Bells. By September of 1820, the terrifying happenings at the Bell household had been going on for 3 years, and somehow the Bell family had just learned to live with it. However, John Bell was not doing good. It was like the longer these strange things were happening, the more and more John seemed to become a shell of his former self. His sudden dazes and realized she recognized her as somebody from the village. This was a neighbor of hers. And so Esther yelled out a friendly hello. But this woman in black with her head down didn't turn around, she didn't react, she just kept on slowly walking down the lane towards the Bell house. And so Esther began walking a little bit faster, getting closer and closer to this woman, and she yelled out a few more times, "Hey, hello, how are you?" But each time, this woman in black just appeared not to hear Esther. And Esther, she's looking around, and there's nobody else out. It's just her and this woman who's now about 15 feet away from her. And so Esther starts to feel really uncomfortable about this woman. And so Esther just stops on the road and stares at the back of this woman. And the second Esther stopped, this woman who was trudging along also suddenly stopped. And then she reached up with her hands, her back is still to Esther, and she took her bonnet off of her head. A bonnet is a type of hat. And then she dropped the bonnet on the ground, and right away this woman's black matted hair kind of tumbled down over her back. And then this woman, without moving, began reaching up and stroking her hair, running her fingers through her hair as if she was trying to comb it out. And so Esther is watching this, kind of wondering what's going on here. And so Esther began walking slowly closer and closer to this woman to make sure she was okay. But with each step that Esther took towards this woman began running her hands faster and faster through her hair until it almost looked impossible. She was moving so fast. And then Esther realized with horror that she wasn't just combing her hair. This woman was grabbing clumps of her hair and pulling them out of her head. In fact, Esther could literally hear the hair being ripped from this woman's scalp. And so before long, there was hair all over the ground around this woman. And so Esther at this point is terrified. She thinks there's something wrong with this woman. And so she runs around this woman without looking at her, charges into her house, which is right in front of this lady. She goes inside, she locks the door behind her. And then Esther calls out for one of her sisters who was home and said, come here, come here. And the two of them went to the front window and they look out onto the road and they see the woman. She's still there in the same spot, ripping her hair out, but Esther makes eye contact with this woman. And the second that happens, the woman freezes. Her hands are still in her hair and she's looking directly up at Esther. And Esther and her sister, they're kind of taken aback by the way this woman is looking at them. And then this woman slowly brings her hands down and she's staring up at Esther the whole time. And then she turns suddenly and walks around the side of the property out of view of Esther and her sister. And so Esther and her sister, they shriek, they leave the front window and they run over to the side window where this woman was heading. And they saw this woman climbing up and over their fence, getting into their side property, and behind her were now 3 children who they had not seen before, just marching right behind this woman in black. And so this woman and these 3 children, in plain sight of Esther and her sister, they walk into this grove of trees on the Bell property. And so Esther and her sister, they're just staring, they have no idea what's happening, and then one by one, the woman first, then each of the children climbed their own trees. And then once all 4 of them were up in these trees, they turned around so they were all looking directly at Esther and her sister, and then they all began swaying with their bodies in the trees, getting these trees to bend and wave hard left and right. And so Esther and her sister are horrified, and as they're staring, Esther's husband just happens to come through the front door. And so Esther yells for him to come over here and look out the window, look what they're doing out there. And so Esther's husband, he runs over to the window and he looks out, but he can't see the woman or the 3 kids. He can only see trees swaying unnaturally left and right. And so Esther and her sister, they realize he's not seeing what we're seeing, what's happening. And before long, they're screaming. The husband's trying to figure out what's going on. And finally, the trio just ran from the window, went out the back door, and ran around to the side yard to go confront this woman and these children. But when they got out to the grove of trees, the woman, the kids, they were gone, and there was no tracks anywhere on the ground to indicate that anybody had been there recently. Not long after this incident, sometime in October of 1820, John Bell and one of his sons were out for a walk on their farm. And as they walked, suddenly John stopped and threw his hands up to his face as if he was protecting himself from someone trying to hit him. And then all of a sudden, John's face just went totally slack and his body began to contort into these horrible, grotesque angles, and his back began to arch so far it looked like his back would break. And so John's son, he's watching this happen. He has no idea what to do. And so he just runs over and grabs his dad and tries to pull him upright. And as he does this, this horrifying shriek fills the air. John's son has no idea where it's coming from, but it's so loud it stops him in his tracks. And then as fast as all of this had happened, it all stopped. John was back to normal, laying on the ground, coming to, and the shrieking was gone. It was silent on their farm. And so John's son turns to his dad, and he sees John is crying on the ground. And he says to his son, "I don't have much time left." John's son would help him up, and then the two of them silently just walked back to the house, and John went straight to bed. A few weeks later, on the morning of December 19th, 1820, John didn't come down for breakfast, and so his family went up to his bedroom to make sure he was okay. But when they found him, he was still laying in bed, he was breathing, but no matter what they did, they couldn't wake him up. And so one of John's sons ran to the medicine cabinet inside of their house, but when he opened it up, all the medicine was gone, and in their place was this strange glass vial that contained a smoky, dark liquid that the son had never seen before and no one in the family had seen before. And so the family immediately called for a doctor to come to their house, both for John and also to see what this liquid was. And so the doctor showed up. He didn't really know what to do for John. It didn't make sense that he just was not waking up. And then the doctor checked on this liquid and he said, you need to test this on some farm animals to make sure we know what it does. And so the family went out and found a stray cat and they force-fed it some of this liquid, and within minutes, the cat had died. The Bell family swore they had not put that vial in the medicine cabinet. They had no idea what it was or how it got there. As for John, he would not wake up that day, and in fact, the following morning, when he was still in bed, he died. After John's death, the strange occurrences at the Bell household basically all came to a stop, for the most part. Some people in town reported, after John's death, seeing strange lights floating around the Bell property, and also sometimes they reported hearing a strange sing-song voice kind of coming from somewhere out around their property. John's wife, Lucy, would remain inside of that house until 1838, when she passed away. Today, there's nothing left of the Bell household. However, there is a cave on their property, an underground cave, and people swear that's where whatever tormented the Bells came from. One morning in early June of 2011, in the Russian city of Kazan, a 49-year-old Russian woman named Fagiliu Mukametsanov woke up feeling nauseous. Fagiliu had recently had some health problems, and her doctors had told her that she really needed to take it easy, don't do anything that really stressed her out or made her mad, basically just relax. And so, on that morning, this is exactly what Fagiliu decided to do. Instead of pushing through her nausea to go to work anyways that day, she decided she would call out from work and stay home and have some tea and try to just feel better. But a little while later, when Fagiliu was in the kitchen making tea, her husband, Fagili, he came in and asked her how she was doing, and she said, you know what, I actually feel worse. My nausea has gotten worse, my chest hurts, and I'm starting to sweat. I'm gonna go lie down in the bedroom. But as Fagiliu walked across the kitchen to go lay down, her chest suddenly tightened tenfold, and she collapsed to the ground unconscious. Fagili rushed over to her and tried to wake her up, and when he couldn't, he rushed to the phone and dialed 112, which is Russia's emergency line, and he called for an ambulance. And then when the ambulance arrived, Fagiliu was not breathing, and by the time they got her to the hospital, she was declared dead. She had died from a heart attack. Fagili, who had been married to Fagiliu, his wife, for almost 30 years, was absolutely heartbroken, but he and his wife's religion encouraged people to have funerals within 24 hours of a loved one passing away. And so despite the fact that Fagili was basically despondent from all his grief, he pretty much immediately began calling relatives and friends and making preparations for Fagiliu's funeral, which would take place the next day. The next morning, Fagili woke up and put on his best suit, and then he joined his and his wife's family and friends at the funeral home for Fagiliu's funeral. When Fagili walked inside of the funeral home, he saw there were all these wooden chairs facing forward towards the front of the room, and at the front of the room, up on a table, was his wife's coffin, which was open and surrounded by all the flowers that Fagili had barely been able to buy with the little bit of money that he and his wife had. Fagili slowly made his way down the middle of the room to his wife's coffin, and the other people that were there saw him coming and got out of the way in respect to, the husband of the deceased. And so Fagili, he walks up and he looks down at his wife, who again, it's open casket so we can see her, and he was struck by her appearance. She just did not look right. Now, Fagili did not have enough money to embalm his wife, which means to preserve a dead body and make it look like it's very lifelike. And so instead, the people who worked in this funeral home had just applied heavy makeup to Fagiliu's face to try to make her appear more lifelike, but it really hadn't worked. To Fagili, it didn't even look like his wife. After all, Fagiliu never even wore makeup, and so to see her with heavy eyeliner and bright red lipstick was just totally bizarre. Behind Fagili was Fagili's family and Fagiliu's relatives all assembled in the first row, and they were beginning their prayers for the dead. And so Fagili, he took a few more looks at his wife, and then he stepped back and joined the first row. And so as Fagili was standing there holding his mother's and brother's hand, he closed his eyes and did his best to focus on the words of the prayer. instead of on the grief he was feeling for his wife. And as he was doing that, his mother, who was on his right side, suddenly broke from the words of the prayer and let out this strange crying sound. And Fagili, he opened his eyes and looked over at his mother, expecting her to be collapsed on the ground from all the grief she was experiencing. But instead, he saw his mother was trembling and looking straight ahead. And so Fagili followed her gaze, and what he saw at the front of the room made Fagili want to faint. His wife, Fagiliu, was now sitting straight up in her coffin. She wasn't making a sound, but she was looking out at the crowd of people with her strange makeup on her face, just staring at them with wide eyes. And for a second, everybody in the funeral home noticed this and went totally quiet, and both Fagiliu and the mourners just stared at each other. And then Fagiliu began screaming, but at first it was like she couldn't make any sound, and it was this raspy, dry yell that was coming out of her mouth, but then it built and built until it was sort of like a bellow or a roar. And when this loud, deep, guttural sound began coming out of Fagiliu's mouth, the mourners in the room began screaming too, and suddenly it was absolute chaos inside of this building. As funeral workers rushed to call emergency services, not knowing what else to do, Fagili, who also had been screaming after seeing his wife arise from the dead, he kind of snapped out of it and ran to his wife, and he embraced her, and when he did, Fagiliu went from screaming to silent, and she looked up at her husband with wide, scared eyes and began crying, and then she slumped forward into Fagili's arms. At this point, Fagili's family and Fagiliu's family saw what was happening, and they kind of snapped out of it too, and they rushed forward, and they helped Fagili lift Fagiliu out of her coffin, and they laid her down on the ground. And even though she wasn't moving, her eyes were open, and she was looking up at her family, just absolutely terrified, with all her makeup running from her tears. And then 12 minutes later, when Fagiliu finally was rushed to the hospital, she was declared dead again. It would turn out that when Fagiliu collapsed on her kitchen floor, she really did have a heart attack, but it didn't kill her. She was just unconscious, and her breathing was very shallow, and she wasn't moving, and nobody noticed. And so when Fagiliu kind of came to and woke up inside of her coffin at her funeral, she likely was okay, all things considered. She was, healthy enough to be alive. But when she looked around the room and saw she was at her own funeral and sitting in her coffin, the stress of that moment had given her another heart attack, and this one had been fatal. Today's video is sponsored by NordVPN. Have you ever sat down to watch one episode of a show and then you black out and wake up like 3 days later and you've binged the entire series? Well, that's what happened to me and old Seagull Lung with Bobo the Burmese Alley Cat. It's a touching show on Catflix about a Burmese alley cat with emphysema who does his best to growl and hiss and stand his ground at anyone or anything that passes by his alley. Admittedly, this show is pretty one-dimensional. It just focuses on that aspect of Bobo's life. But me and Lung love it. And so when season 89 came out, me and Lung had to watch it immediately. However, when we fired up our flubber-powered laptop, we saw season 89 was only available to stream on the world's most remote island, Pitcairn Island. And so, with no other choices, me and old Seagull Lung hopped on a blind, emotionally unstable Phoenix and made the 4,400-mile journey to Pitcairn. Checked into our Pitcairn hotel, and we're getting ready to feast our retinas on BBTBAC. Lungy turned to me and said, "Papa, we had a net NordVPN moeten," which of course in Dutch means, "Dad, we should have just got NordVPN." With NordVPN's worldwide access, you can enjoy instant, secure access to hundreds of streaming websites worldwide. And with their uninterrupted streaming, you won't have to worry about buffering. So enjoy all that Bobo the Emphysema cat right from the comfort of your home with NordVPN. Right now, you can get a 2-year plan plus 4 additional months for free when you sign up at nordvpn.com/MrBallen. It's risk-free with Nord's 30-day money-back guarantee. Again, that's nordvpn.com/MrBallen, or you can click the link in the description below. Okay, back to the stories. On October 15th, 2003, a newlywed couple named Tina and Gabe Watson arrived in Australia for their honeymoon. They were both 26 years old and lived in Alabama, and neither of them made very much money. Tina worked in the kids department of a clothing store, and Gabe worked for his father at a packaging company. But Gabe's family had gifted this honeymoon trip to Australia to Gabe and Tina, and so the couple was so excited about it, and they had taken actually a whole year to plan this trip out. It was going to be the adventure of their lives. Once in Australia, the couple spent the first week in Sydney, which is one of the biggest cities in the country. They went on a river cruise, they visited the famous Sydney Opera House, and they went to see the koalas at the zoo, something Tina was very intent on doing because she loved animals. And then on October 21st, so 6 days into their big trip, the couple headed north to the city of Townsville, which is this beautiful beach town that's right near the Great Barrier Reef. The Great Barrier Reef is the world's largest and most famous coral reef system. This was going to be the real highlight of their trip. Gabe had grown up loving the water, and now as an adult, his passion was scuba diving. He was a trained rescue diver, and any chance he got back home in Alabama, he would go diving. As for Tina, scuba diving kind of scared her. She didn't like the idea of being underwater for extended periods of time and breathing in underwater. It just felt so foreign that she didn't like it. But she knew Gabe really wanted her to go scuba diving with him in Australia, and so 10 months earlier, in January of 2003, Tina had begun taking scuba diving lessons, and then right before they headed out for this trip to Australia, Tina had gotten certified in scuba diving. So, after arriving in Townsville, Gabe and Tina would spend the night in a hotel, and then early the next morning, the couple would get up and make their way down to the dock where they would board a diving boat. This boat was going to take them out into the open water, right over this famous shipwreck called the Yongola, where lots of people scuba dive, and this Yongola wreck is right near the Great Barrier Reef. So it's a truly amazing place to go scuba diving. When the couple actually was out on the open water, they looked around and just could not believe how stunning everything really was. The beach town at a distance was unbelievable, and the water was perfectly clear blue, where they could see thousands of fish shimmering and swimming all around them. Finally, the dive boat came to a stop over the area where the Yongola wreck was, and Gabe and Tina began putting on their dive gear, as did the other 4 tourists who were also on this diving trip. Now, Gabe and Tina were dive partners, which meant for this dive, they were instructed not to leave each other really at any point until they're back on the surface. But initially, once they and the other divers were put into the water, the entire group swam down together 100 feet to the bottom of the ocean where this shipwreck was. And at first, everything was going great. The swim down was easy, and then once they got down there, because the water was so clear and sunlight could reach them, they were able to look at each other and just really take in how spectacular this really was. But unfortunately, Gabe, he looked at his wrist at some point and noticed his dive computer, which tells you how much air you have left and what depth you're at, was malfunctioning, and so he signaled to Tina that he needed to go to the surface and get his computer fixed. And so he and Tina would swim away from the group back up to the surface, and then once on the surface, Gabe was able to talk to the dive leader on the boat, and he was able to get his dive computer fixed. And then after only a couple of minutes of being back on the surface, Gabe and Tina went back under the water and began heading back down towards the rest of the group. And as Gabe and Tina approached the rest of the group, they saw they were all kind of swimming around in dive pairs around the Yongola wreck. And so Gabe and Tina, they got down there and they joined the queue and began as well moving as a pair around the wreck. Back up on the surface, the dive leader, who was up in the boat, was just kind of sitting there waiting for the divers to come back up, when all of a sudden he noticed there was this sudden eruption of air bubbles coming up to the surface. And so he peered over the side of the boat to see what was going on, and Gabe, who had only left the surface after fixing his dive computer maybe 5 minutes earlier, came bombing up out of the water. And when he did, the dive leader immediately noticed that Tina was not with him. And before the dive leader could even ask Gabe what was going on, Gabe, who was obviously very panicked, he ripped off his mask and he began trying to tell the dive leader that something was wrong with his wife, that she had sunk away from him and he couldn't get to her and he needed help. And so the dive leader immediately put on a scuba tank, he jumped in the water and swam down as fast as he could to the wreck down below. And when he got there, he immediately saw Tina by herself laying on the sand on the bottom of the ocean, just totally motionless on her back. And so the dive leader, he swam over to her, he scooped her up, and he brought her all the way back to the surface. And then once on the surface, he put Tina into the boat, and then the dive leader, he climbed inside and immediately began doing CPR on Tina. And for 45 minutes, the dive leader tried to do CPR, tried everything he could to save Tina, but unfortunately, it was not enough, and Tina passed away. An autopsy would later reveal that Tina had died from something called an air embolism, which is when an air bubble gets trapped in a blood vessel and blocks it. In scuba divers, this can happen from holding your breath for too long or trying to ascend too quickly. One theory about how this could have happened to Tina was based on what Gabe said happened when he and Tina went back down to the wreck after he got his dive computer fixed. He said they got down there, everything was fine, they were swimming around like the other dive pairs, taking pictures, when Tina started to panic, kind of randomly, and she reached out for Gabe, and Gabe said she knocked his oxygen mask off his face, and so Gabe was kind of starting to panic, and he got the mask back on, at which point Tina was kind of floating away from him, and so Gabe, not really knowing what to do, said he went to the surface to get help. And so in that time frame, perhaps Tina, tried to rush to the surface on her own, giving herself the air embolism, or maybe in her panic, she had held her breath, giving herself the air embolism. But it wasn't long after Tina's death was ruled an accident and the case was closed that the other 4 people who were on that dive with Gabe and Tina began reaching out to Tina's family. These divers had seen something very strange happen right around the time Tina died, and they felt like they had to tell someone. One of these 4 divers would tell Tina's family that as they were swimming around the wreck, they saw Gabe and Tina come back down after Gabe had fixed his dive computer, and pretty quickly after they reached the bottom, Gabe seemed to give Tina a hug, like a really strong bear hug. Now, there's no reason any diver would hug another diver underwater, certainly not that hard, unless it was some sort of rescue attempt. And this diver who witnessed this told Tina's family that this did not look like a rescue attempt. It looked like Gabe was trying to restrain Tina, and Tina was trying to get away from Gabe. After a few moments of watching this, the same diver would see Gabe release Tina, and at that point, Tina would go limp and float to the bottom, and Gabe would rush to the surface where he would tell the dive leader that he had this emergency with his wife. This new information led Australian authorities to charge Gabe with murder. They alleged that Gabe intentionally turned off Tina's air and then put her in that bear hug to make sure she couldn't turn it back on again. Gabe, however, has always denied this, saying his wife really just panicked and he was trying to help her but couldn't and then went to the surface. Gabe ultimately pleaded guilty to involuntary manslaughter in Australia and served 18 months in prison. Prosecutors in Alabama then also tried to charge Gabe with murder or something else in connection to Tina's death, but ultimately a judge dismissed the case. One final note about this story, which also happens to be the reason most people know about this story, is that 2 of the 4 divers who were down there with Gabe and Tina were taking underwater pictures at the time that Tina died. Here is a photo they developed from this trip, which clearly shows Tina in the background just moments after Gabe had released her and she sunk to the bottom and died. In July of 1848, a 25-year-old man named Phineas Gage got a job working construction on the Hudson River Railroad in New York. At this time in America, railroads were being laid all over the country, and so lots of workers like Phineas were needed to blast rock out of the way to lay down these railroad tracks. And as it happened, Phineas was an expert in explosives. He had learned how to set controlled blasts growing up on his family's farm in New Hampshire, and then later in his life, he had worked in a mine blasting through rock. And so in addition to just being the ideal railroad worker for this time in America, when Phineas actually started working in New York on this railroad, his co-workers immediately started looking up to him. Phineas was extremely smart and energetic. He was this incredible conversationalist. He was charismatic and funny and a natural leader. And so just 2 months into starting this new job, it was no surprise to anyone who knew Phineas or worked with Phineas that he was promoted to blasting foreman, which meant Phineas would lead the explosives team. Phineas was so excited about this promotion that he went to a blacksmith and had a custom tamping iron made. A tamping iron is a long metal rod that's used to pack explosives. When railroad workers wanted to blast through, let's say, a big rock, they would start by drilling a deep but skinny hole in the rock. Then they would pour blasting powder inside, then they'd put a fuse inside, and then using this tamping iron, they would push the blasting powder and the fuse deep into this hole inside of this rock or whatever it was they were blowing up. And then once it was packed, they would ignite it. Usually, tamping irons were sort of rough tools that looked like crowbars, but Phineas really wanted something special to commemorate this promotion. And so Phineas had the blacksmith make this perfectly straight, smooth, 4-foot-long metal tamping iron, and on one end was a pointed side, and on the other was a blunted side. And this rod, it weighed about 13 pounds, and it was about 1.25 inches in diameter. And Phineas loved this tamping iron. He brought it with him not just to work, but basically anywhere he went. On September 3rd, 1848, so not long after Phineas's big promotion, Phineas and his explosives team were blasting through some rock that ran through a forest. And Phineas, he was right up front over the blasting site, helping them prep the explosive. His team had drilled that long, deep, skinny hole into the rock they were about to blow up, and then blasting powder was put inside, a fuse was put inside, and then Phineas took his tamping iron and began packing the powder and fuse deep into the rock. And the way he did this is he used the blunt end of his tamping iron to pack the explosives, which meant the pointed end was sticking out of the rock. And so as Phineas is doing this, someone behind him slipped on a rock. One of his men tripped or something, and so Phineas, with his hands kind of on his tamping iron, turned to the right to look and see what was going on. And when he did this, somehow his tamping iron that was inside of this skinny hole must have nudged against the inside of the rock, created a spark, and ignited the explosive inside of the rock, which meant the tamping iron was basically fired like a missile out of this hole into Phineas's head. It went in his cheek, up behind his left eye, up and out of his skull, and then shot 80 feet away, landing on the ground covered in Phineas's blood and brains. This happened so quickly that for a second after this thing has blown through Phineas's head, Phineas just stood there upright with his eyes wide, and then suddenly a geyser of blood began shooting out of the top of his head, and then Phineas fell backwards onto the ground. When Phineas's body hit the ground, he began having a seizure, at which point his co-workers, who were still kind of shaken up from this sudden blast, they rushed over and tried to kind of position him in a way that he wouldn't hurt himself. But I mean, they're looking at him and he's literally missing half of his head. He's covered in blood. And they're thinking, there's nothing we can do for him but basically wait for him to die. And so all of Phineas's co-workers, who adored Phineas, just stood there very somber watching their boss die. But eventually, Phineas stopped having a seizure, and then he opened his eyes and he looked up at his crew and he sat up and he said, "What happened?" Now remember, half of his head has been blown out by a 13-pound, 4-foot-long metal rod that has shot through his head. And his co-workers, when they heard how clearly he was speaking and how focused his eyes were, they couldn't believe it. How in the world is this guy alive, let alone having a coherent conversation with them? And so the co-workers told Phineas, "Please lie down, we'll get you help, lie down, relax." But Phineas, who still had blood also shooting out of his head, just kind of stood up casually and walked over to the railroad cart and signaled for his crew to take him back into town. And so the crew, they're looking over at Phineas, who now is literally head to toe just red from blood. Still bleeding, but less so, and he's just sitting on the railroad cart waiting for them. And so they walk over to him and they start the slow 1-mile journey into town on this railroad cart. And the whole time they're all kind of looking at Phineas, expecting him to die any second. But instead, Phineas is just kind of looking around with half of his head. And at some point he pulled out his logbook and carefully wrote down what time they were leaving their work site to make sure his crew was accurately paid. And then finally they reached town and Phineas was still very much alive and looking around, acting like nothing had happened to him. And the co-workers helped him to his hotel, and Phineas just sat outside on a chair in front of his hotel, just people watching, while his crew went and got a doctor. A doctor soon arrived, and he too was completely shocked at Phineas's appearance, but even more so was Phineas's eyes. He looked at the doctor, and his eyes were totally focused, like he was all there, totally lucid, looking at the doctor, waiting for him to come over and help him out with his little injury. And when the doctor kind of timidly approached Phineas, Phineas very famously said as he sat on his chair, "Doctor, here's business enough for you." Like everyone else, the doctor fully assumed that despite Phineas's miraculous recovery from this injury, that he would soon die from this horrific wound in his head. And so the doctor moved Phineas up into the hotel, put him in a bed, and then basically made him comfortable. Now, the doctor at this point was not trying to save Phineas. He felt like there was nothing he could do to save Phineas. At this point, it was like mercy. Let's make this as pain-free as possible for Phineas as he inevitably dies from this injury. But Phineas didn't die. He would break out of it and basically be okay again. However, his personality at first, after he came out of this state of delirium, was not really the same. No longer was he this funny, smart, charming, confident leader. Instead, he was this guy who seemed to have lost all of his inhibitions and was kind of childlike. He swore all the time. He would tell people he had these crazy plans he was going to go do, but he would never follow through with them. And he would tell his nieces and nephews these wild stories about himself that were obviously made up and not even close to reality. But overall, he was okay, even though you could see his brain pulsing underneath his skin on the side of his head that had been blown off. And within a couple of years of this injury, those changes to Phineas's personality kind of faded, and he really did become old Phineas. However, there was one unique quirk to Phineas post-injury that never went away. And that was Phineas's kind of unhealthy love for the tamping iron that had blown through his head. After his injury, Phineas kind of stopped making friends, and any friends he did have, he really didn't try to keep those relationships up. He didn't get married, he didn't have kids. Instead, the tamping iron became sort of like his best friend. He took it everywhere with him, even posing at one point with the tamping iron the way you would expect a couple to pose for a photo. 12 years after his horrific injury, Phineas would develop seizures, likely from the injury, and then he would die with his beloved tamping rod right by his side. His case changed neuroscience forever by showing that an injury to the brain could affect specific personality traits. Today, Phineas's skull and his tamping rod are on display at Harvard Medical School. So that's going to do it. If you enjoyed today's story, be sure to check out our podcast called the MrBallen's Podcast. We have over 100 episodes, many of which are brand new and exclusive to the podcast, which means you cannot get them on YouTube. So go check it out. It's called the MrBallen's Podcast, and it's available exclusively on Amazon Music.